So my talk today is going to be an introduction to wins above replacement, kind of a mid-level intro to what we do. Hopefully you know a little bit about it. That's me. Hans is on the other side over here. Hans is in the back right there. He does baseball reference day-to-day. I've been kicked upstairs. So he's running things on a day-to-day basis. We also, in the process of doing this, we had some outside experts. We had Sean Smith, who, a gold star to anyone who gets the reference. Sean Smith, who works for a team now, he produced kind of the initial formulas, the initial equations that we used for WAR on his site, Baseball Value, I think was the name of it. So we took that from him in 2009. He worked with us, implemented it as the initial WAR numbers on Baseball Reference. Then in 2012, we worked on revamping the stat and kind of working through each of the components. And there were probably 24 tedious emails that Tom Tango answered for me as we were working on different parts. So basically, all of this comes down to measuring value. You know, what are the values of players? How do we measure values of players? And there are a lot of different views on what matters. There are a lot of different views on what matters when you measure value of a player. And so, to some degree, I think when you create a system like this, you have to decide, this is what I want to measure, this is what's important, and I'm going to make decisions based on what I think is important. And to some degree, we've made those decisions. We're not going to necessarily change those decisions. And so we've built a system, and if you disagree with what we feel is important, you need to create your own system, and we can kind of discuss where those are different. So some of the ways you can do this, let me see if I can get fortunately I have a very poor pointer here, but you can start with just wins and losses, right? The players who are on teams that win are more valuable than the players who are on teams that lose a lot. You can look at how many runs the players score, or how many runs the pitchers allow. If you want to get a little more advanced, you can just look at win probability added, which correlates perfectly to the team wins. Then kind of going down the path where we're at, you can look at components, OPS, WOBA, ERA, FIP, all those kinds of more high-level analytics that the industry has introduced over the last 10 to 20 years. And then from there, you can get to more maybe scouting sorts of things, more StatCast-oriented things, spin rate, launch angle, exit velocity, all that kind of stuff. So the question that you have to ask yourself is, what do you care mostly about? Do you care about did the player action directly lead to a winning outcome? Is that what's most important to you? So if some of you may have been aware, there was somewhat of a Twitter argument between Bill James and people like myself and Baseball Prospectus, because we had Aaron Judge and Jose Altuve at a relatively equal level, but if you look at it, Judge was not very clutch, to be frank, last year. And so the choice that we've made in our system is that that's not something we're going to worry about. And Bill might have a different point of view, which is fine. I think it's a completely reasonable viewpoint, but you have to kind of set your marker as to where you're at. So where we're at, and I see this as a continuum here, where you have wins and losses on one side, skills, and maybe StatCast on the other. Our approach is, if I was a GM who had a replacement level team, and I could take any of these players' performance from that year, which one would give me the most wins? Okay, if I could have any one of these performances, which one would give me the most wins? So that's the question I'm trying to answer when we look at our wins above replacement calculation. And there are lots of other possible calculations. These have been going on I call these Uberstats. Okay, these are kind of one number that compiles everything that the player had done. So I consider calculating WAR to be similar to calculating gross domestic product for economists. The instructions for calculating that, you can download them. They're like 150 pages. The definitions can be a little vague. You can interpret them in different ways. The data might change over time, like park factors might change with another year of data. So things can be restated. Every quarter they restate the previous quarter's GDP. So these are not numbers that are fixed in stone like batting average, though with the way official scores handle things, batting average isn't quite as fixed as you think. So all these different approaches, they still come to a fairly similar point of view across players, right? These are different approaches. Fergie Jenkins, this is since '54, is rated between 11th and 12th in 4 different systems, very different systems. Reggie Jackson, a little bit more variation. So how we create our war stat, and one of the things I hope that you'll get from this talk is that we try very, very hard to account for all the possible factors we can. We get a lot of emails when these kind of war discussions come up online. We get a lot of emails or discussion like, well, you never considered such and such. We probably did. I've been doing this for 10 years now. We've probably considered it, probably studied it, and if we don't account for it, we found it wasn't an issue. Now, I realize that sounds like an appeal to authority, and I apologize for that, but I just want to assure you we take this very seriously, and we try very hard to account for all these different things. So the basic way we do it is we compare the player to average across various roles in the game. So the things that they do on the field, we're comparing them to the average player in that situation. And then we have various contexts that we have to adjust for, and then we look at how they would help an average team. Okay, so that gives you wins above average. From there, then, we compare an average player with that playing time to a replacement level player. Okay, so essentially, for us, war is always the average contribution plus some playing time component based on where the replacement level is set. And so again, we have a ton of stuff on the site. You know, this is all stuff, links. These are very long articles that we have on the site. For the further discussion, I've tried to accumulate all of the discussion that, from this past fall with Joe Posnanski and Bill James. So all of that's on the site. You can find all of that on our About page. So first things first, we're going to compare players to the average. Okay, so one thing I want to stress, when you sum all of these components, so all the components I'm going to show you, when you add them all up across a league season, they add up to 0. Okay, everything adds up to 0. Everything is against a league average. So you're either better than average positive or worse than average negative. And then later on, we're going to discuss replacement level. So first thing is batting, most important thing for the position player. First thing is batting. So we use a linear weights based system. The linear weights change based on what the run scoring environment is. So different things have different values depending if it's 1968 versus 1999. So we adjust based on that. We park adjust everything. Of course, we filter out all the pitcher hitting, so we don't. So the NL and the AL batters are on similar scales. We're not including NL pitchers in those calculations. We also include play-by-play things. So for example, an infield single is not worth as much as an outfield single, right? You can't advance the base runner multiple bases in those situations. So that's something that we account for. The other things we account for that I don't think is in Fangraphs WOBA is we separate strikeouts versus non-strikeout outs. So for example, when I was in Little League, just put the bat on the ball was like the #1 mantra, right? Because you put the bat on the ball, you might get on by air. Major league players are such phenomenal fielders, that's not true. So strikeout is actually less worse generally than putting a ball in play and getting it out, all right? Because double plays are so prevalent that you're better off striking out in some cases than you are putting the ball in play and grounding into a double play. So that's one of the things that we account for. That wasn't true in the teens, 20s, 30s, 40s of baseball because the fielders just weren't as good at that time. So I'm going to show a number of slides like this. So on the left side, we have the career totals, and these are all in runs. And on the right side, we have the last season. Okay, so I have leaders and trailers. And I'm going to run through these. I'm not going to go through all the lists. It's mostly just to show you kind of the scale that we're talking about here. My favorite Larry Bowa stat here is that if Larry Bowa, second worst hitter in Major League history, if Larry Bowa hit 186 consecutive home runs, he would have a .400 slugging percentage for his career. So the second most important thing that position players do on the offensive side, at least, is base running. So obviously, stolen bases, caught stealing, biggest part of this. Now, baseball is a very old sport, back to 1871 for our stats. Caught stealing is not actually included in all of those seasons officially. So we have to, if you're trying to create a competitor baseball reference, you're going to have to account for like missing caught stealings, missing stolen strikeouts, all that kind of stuff. And it can be done, but it's non-trivial to do. So we have to account for missing caught stealing data. With play-by-play, thank you to the heroes at RetroSheet, we can track base advancement. So I know exactly how many times a runner goes from first to third on a single, exactly how many times they get thrown out on base, exactly how many times they stop at second. And we can track all of that and put a run value on that. And so base running is not just stolen bases. It's how many bases you take on pass balls, how many bases you take on wild pitches. All that kind of stuff can get how many times you score from third on a ground out. All that stuff can get added into the mix, and we can put a value on those things. The last one here is double play avoidance. So we try to look at context-free situations. So if you're on a great team and you come up with a lot of runners on base, we're not going to ding you for grounding into double plays as long as it's at the league rate level that we would expect for you hitting in that situation. So if you ground into 50 double plays, but you have a runner on base every single time you come up, that's not going to be a negative for you. What's going to be a negative is if you ground into more double plays given your opportunities, or you'll get a benefit if it's less. So here are the base runners. Not a whole lot of surprise here. Ricky Henderson, Willie Wilson, guys who are phenomenal at stealing bases. Chase Utley's a guy, didn't make this list, but he's a phenomenal base runner. He stole for a high percentage, but he took every extra base possible and rarely got thrown out. On the bottom, you'll notice all these guys are big, slow power hitters who, one, ground into a ton of double plays, like Piazza, just smacking the ball everywhere, grounding into double plays because he hits it so hard so often. So he loses out because of that. On the base advance issue, I looked this up. So it may seem like going from first to third is not something that's worth measuring necessarily, but Paul Konerko was on first base when a single was hit 533 times in his career. He advanced to third base a total of 15% of those times, okay, which I haven't given any context. Tim Raines was on first base 522 times when a single was hit. He advanced to third base 36% of the times. So that's, over their career, that's about 110 more times that Tim Raines was on third base than Paul Konerko was. Okay, so that's 110 bases advanced that Paul Konerko did not advance. That's a significant value. Being on third instead of second added a lot of value those 110 times. So then, obviously, we also have fielding that we have to consider about. I'm not going to talk a lot about the particulars of these systems. We try to use the state of the art for whatever seasons we have. We use Sports Info Solutions data when it's available, which is back to 2003. Previous to that, we use a system created by Sean Smith called Total Zone Rating. That's based on where the ball was hit. So we have batted ball location data for a lot of those seasons back to the 80s. It has batted ball types, so line drive, fly ball, ground ball. All that stuff gets thrown into the mix, and we get a value from that. And then in the 80s, previous to that, we use a regression-based system that would be comparable to an advanced range factor, looking at how many fly balls are caught by the outfielders, et cetera. And these, there are a lot of systems that use. Michael Humphreys has a system that's probably the best around for analyzing those seasons of data. Excuse me. Beyond that, we don't include pitcher defense. Pitchers, we assume that we just put that into their pitching WAR, so that doesn't get calculated there. And then other stuff that we could do, maybe catcher framing, we might add that. I know Sports Info Solutions has that. Back to 2011, we're looking at possibly utilizing that in WAR. I would love to assess the current measures with StatCast data. What correlates well with what we see in StatCast. How well does TZR correlate with what we see in StatCast? So if there's anybody here, I don't know if there's anybody here that can help with that, but if there is, I would put a word in for that. So here are the defensive numbers. Again, this is relative to their position. So we have third baseman, shortstop, center fielder, third baseman. And so this is relative to position. And I'm just going to do a thinking face about the all-time trailers, if you're looking, at who's number one under the trailers there. And we'll just move on without discussing that too much. Position players. So last slide was just relative to their position. So I think we all know that a shortstop is a more difficult position to play than first base. So hopefully you've all reached that level of sabermetric insight. So center field is harder than right field and left field. And so there's a defensive spectrum, right? A continuum of difficulty. And we try to encapsulate that. So the ability to play shortstop has a lot of value. And so this doesn't judge whether you're playing it well or not. It's just, are you playing that position? Okay, so these are the adjustments that we make. This is for the current season, that we make for the various positions. You can see some open questions here. DH value, is that the correct place to put it? Because there's some evidence that DHs have a penalty when they come to the plate. So perhaps we're overly penalizing them. And Jeff Zimmerman has a work that I would recommend. I was on Hardball Times. That there are two ways to get at this. One, you could look at what the difference in hitting is across all the positions, or you could look at if a shortstop moves to second base, how does his fielding change? Or if a shortstop moves to third base, how does his fielding change? Left field, center field, right field, center field, et cetera. So people have done that. I would like to do a little more of that to put a little bit more theory underneath where these numbers come from. But that's kind of the idea underpinning this. So again, this is just the position. So you can have shortstops on the left, DHs, first baseman on the right. There's nothing to, and that's purely a playing time issue. So how does this get into wins above average? So I have Barry Bonds, 93. Bonds played 159 games. He was worth 68.3 runs on offense. He was very good defensive left fielder, +3 on defense. If you were an average team and you added Barry Bonds to your team, you would score 4.93 runs per game, and you would allow 4.5 runs per game. So everybody else on the team is average. So we plug this into a Pythagorean win-loss formula, right? Just, run scored squared over, except our exponent, we use what's called the Pythagorean estimator, which is a very accurate one. And the reason you need to use that in this situation is because players can lead to very extreme run environments, right? If you're facing Bob Gibson in 1968, he only had a 1.12 ERA that year. So his run environment is very extreme. And if you try to use a regular Pythagorean curve on that, it's going to break down at the endpoints, okay, at these extreme cases. So Pythagorean is a better choice in that situation. So we compute the exponent, and we find that Barry Bonds, his team, everybody else average, facing average teams, they'd have a 549 win-loss percentage that season. So multiply that, minus 500 team, average team, times 159, you get 7.8 wins above average, okay? And do this for everybody, obviously. One thing I like about this, and we have this on the site, we haven't pushed it really well, is that we have a win-loss percentage here. So that's our rate stat for WAR, is what the win-loss percentage is for that player. All right, and I suppose we could do losses. We could do losses below average as well. Okay, pitchers. So we use run average. We start with the runs allowed. We don't consider earned runs in our system, because if you think about it, earned runs are simply fielding percentage adjusted pitching, right? And we have better defense than that, right? We have better defensive metrics than just fielding percentage. So we use runs average and compare them to the league average pitcher. Now the things that we adjust for here, there are three things. We have the opponent that they face, and it's a little different on the pitching side because starters are only pitching 30 games. Position players are playing 160 games. So the pitchers, there can be a lot of variation within who the pitchers see over 30 games, just random variation. So we adjust for park, opponent, and defensive support. I'll go through those now. Quality of opponent. So we adjust a league average pitcher by the average runs. The league average pitcher is the average runs per game of their opponents. Okay, so one subtlety here is, an AL team playing in the NL, Boston playing in Philadelphia is a different team than Boston playing in New York because they don't have the DH. So you have to account for AL teams playing in the DH with the DH or NL teams having a DH. So I picked some examples here. This is not my best infographic, but both Ryu and Hill pitched for the Dodgers. I filtered out all of their common opponents. So these are their uncommon opponents between the two of them. Hill had one more start on the year, I think one more. So you see Hill had 3 games against the Padres. Ryu had 3 against Colorado, 1 against the Cubs that Hill didn't have. And if you add up their opponents' runs per game, you'll see that Ryu's were slightly more difficult, okay? Park factors, similar thing. We can look at which parks, we know, we have the data, which parks the pitchers pitched in. So we just look at their specific parks. And it's weighted by batters faced in each park. So if you look at that, Ryu also pitched in more difficult parks, most likely because of those 3 games against Colorado versus the 3 games in San Diego, 3 games against San Diego. I didn't split them by home road, but 3 games against Colorado, presumably somewhere in Denver, and 3 games, in some of them in San Diego for Hill. So they have a different park factor applied to their stats. The last one is quality of defense. So we know how many balls in play the pitcher allows. We know what we think of the team's defense. So it's very easy to just multiply that percentage of balls in play times the team defense and assign that value to the pitcher. We could do better. We could maybe add catcher framing, so perhaps pitchers based on called strikes, based on balls. We could look at something weighting that by catcher framing. We could adjust for infield defense versus outfield defense. The Red Sox had a very outfield defense heavy team, so a fly ball pitcher benefits more in that situation. That's one, we don't do that. That would be another place where we could expand on what we do. So this is quality of defense. So this is going to be highly correlated to the team they play on. So obviously Detroit, San Francisco at the bottom, Dodgers, Boston at the top. So add all these together, and we can come up with the run average that an average pitcher would have given that pitcher's context. Okay, so this is not Matt Boyd's ERA or run average. This is if an average pitcher faced the same opponents in the same parks with the same defense that Matt Boyd did, we would expect a league average pitcher to have a 5.7 runs per 9. Okay? If we put the very same pitcher, very same league average pitcher in the same parks, opponents, and defense that Kershaw had, we would expect a 4.12 run average. Okay? That's not saying Kershaw is better. That's saying Kershaw had a run and a half per game average advantage to Boyd. Okay? So Kershaw had a 1.5 run advantage over what Boyd did just starting off without any difference in their ability level. So for example, Matt Boyd, 5.6 ERA, had an 87 ERA plus, not great, below average. But if you look at our wins above average, we have him slightly above average because his context was so hard. He had tough opponents, bad parks, bad defense. Jake Odorizzi, 4.41 ERA, had an average ERA plus, but he had good parks to pitch in, bad offenses to face, and a good defense behind him. So he had a below 0 wins above average. So we, in this case, even though we don't look at Detroit and Tampa as being extreme parks, we would say Boyd with the 5.6 ERA was a better pitcher than Odorizzi with the 4.14. Okay, so that's some of the context that we try to take out of the numbers. So running a little low on time, but we essentially do the same thing we did for Barry Bonds for the pitchers. What would an average team, how would their run scoring change, how would their runs allowed change with this pitcher pitching for them? Multiply it by, do the Pythagorean win-loss, adjust that number, multiply it by games played, and you get wins above average. One last thing we do is we do a small adjustment for relievers based on leverage index, which is a little complicated to explain. But basically, if you're pitching in high leverage and you do well, we give you a little bit of a bonus for that. So one of the knocks on WAR is that relievers are not rated very highly. So for example, Trevor Hoffman shouldn't be in the Hall of Fame. But anyway, so it's not a, relievers are overrated in my opinion, not Barry Bloom's opinion. But in my opinion, relievers are dramatically overrated, and WAR represents that fact. And Barry, when you create your, anyway. So why use a replacement level? So we have wins above average, which seems like a fine stat. Why use replacement level? Why do you have to add in this mythical replacement level player? The problem is, I have two players up here, Troy Neal and Alfonso Soriano, who, according to wins above average, have the same value, more or less. But obviously, Soriano was playing for 13 seasons. Neal was a part-timer for 2 years. It doesn't seem right to say that those are the equivalent player, because being an average player has a lot of value to the major league team. Lots of pennants were lost because they did not have an average player playing at a particular position, right? So we're trying to put a value on that average player other than 0. And so replacement level is essentially a playing time adjustment, okay? It's really a playing time adjustment. And so I just want one takeaway you can take from this is if two players have the same playing time, so two full-time players playing in the same league, it doesn't matter where you set replacement level. They get the same adjustment. So for MVP voting, doesn't matter where you set replacement level. They're the same. They're playing full-time in the same league. It just doesn't matter because the adjustment is the same for both of them. It only really matters when you're talking about career totals or maybe rookie of the year if they have different playing time. So for the leagues, there are two things that we look at. So one is the talent level of the freely available players, things like minor league free agents, things like non-roster invites, Rule 5 draftees. These are roughly freely available talent. We can measure what they do in the league on a regular basis. The second is, what's the difference between the leagues? So players who go from the AL to the NL do better because the NL is not as good of a league as the AL is, and vice versa. And you can measure that and study that over time. So that's how we decide where to set the replacement level based on that study. And recently, I guess 4 years ago now, Fangraphs, we had slightly different replacement levels, which meant that not only were our numbers different for players, but the scale was slightly different. So basically, we met and compromised and worked out. Basically, halfway was 1,000 WAR per season for the entire league, which works out to basically a 48-win team. So if you're a 48-win team, you're a replacement level team. There have only been 2 teams that have won fewer than 48 games since expansion. So that seems like a reasonable place where, if you put together a group of all replacement level players, where you would end up. Beyond that, okay, so now we have the wins above average. We compute, given the player's playing time, what would a replacement player do for his team? So we do the same Pythagorean stuff for a replacement level player. Put all that into the hopper and you get WAR, all right? So wins above average plus this replacement level player's wins below average, and that's WAR. Ta-da. So anyway, recent tweaks that we've done, we've just been working on this in the last month or so. Sports Info Solution occasionally goes back and recalculates numbers based on new thinking, new knowledge, new data that's available. We have not always incorporated those into our WAR numbers. We're kind of doing kind of a wholesale we're doing a wholesale adjustment of those numbers to match up with what Sports Info Solutions feels is the right number. So we're adding those in. Park factors are based on, like the 2016 park factors are based on 2015, 2016, 2017. So now 2017 is done, so we can go back and reassess the 2016 numbers. And the last one, given Ohtani is going to be playing in the field and as a pitcher, at least it sounds that way. We went back and we looked at some of the past players and this was mostly an issue with players in the 30s and 40s. Red Lucas, George Yule. George Yule had like 110, I think, pinch hit appearances. He was a full-time pitcher. And we were not really handling those really well. We were treating them as full-time pitchers instead of kind of splitting it. So we've added an adjustment for that, which if you're a big Red Roughing fan, I'm sorry, his WAR is going down a little bit. The changes are really not very big, but it's about 2.5. At the very extreme, it's 2.5. Nobody's more than 2.5. And that's over like, guys with 35, 40 WAR. That's over the course of their career. So don't freak out, please. Future study. Work more on studying replacement level, where we set that, where it should be set, how the leagues adjust to each other, how things like expansion, integration, World War II, how they affected replacement level, and make sure we're where we want to be for those. The position values, our position values are based on work 10 years ago. It's probably likely that Major League Baseball has changed how they value a shortstop relative to a third baseman, relative to a second baseman. So we probably should look at that at some point soon. Could we put error bars around WAR? I usually think of the error bar being like plus or minus 1 win. So if a guy's at 8.2, a guy's at 8.5, I don't really view them as different. Some people do. I would encourage you not to do that. Defensive metrics, always improve what we can do there. Park factors, I think that's an area that probably warrants more study just generally, not even just in the context of WAR. And then should position players have a strength of opponent as well? I know I've looked at it in the past for a while, like when Albert Pujols was with the Cardinals, he often faced like the worst set of pitchers of any batter in the major leagues. The Cardinals, because they're in the Central, the Central at that time was just horrific in terms of pitching staffs. And so he got to face like really bad pitchers day in, day out. And not that he wasn't a great player, but it probably gave him a little bit of a boost. So lastly, I want to thank Sports Reference crew. We're about 10 strong in Philadelphia. And anyway, the talk is online, so you can refer back to something if I went through it too quickly. But do I have time for one question? One question. All right. Mark says one question.
Say relief pitchers are overrated. What do you say to those teams like Colorado who are paying relief pitchers?
Well, everybody pays. I mean, so the two most valuable relief pitchers this past year were Archie Bradley and Corey Knebel, who were both being paid less, like $570,000. I mean, I think this is more general team building than war related, but I mean, generally you can find live arms for not a whole lot of money, and you often can put those people into reliever roles. But anyway, if there are further questions, I'll go outside afterwards. I'm happy to answer your questions, and Hans will also be around as well. But thank you very much.